It has been nearly a year and a half since the Garmin Epix was released, and now it is finally here, or rather they are finally here. There are now 3 different sizes of watches to choose from, but that's actually just the starting point. These new watches have things like a flashlight and a bunch of new hardware and sensors inside of them, as well as a whole slate of new software features. I've been putting the Epix Pro series through its paces during my training over the last few months, doing everything from trail running from the sea to the top of an 8,000-foot snow-capped mountain in one go, to an Ironman 70.3 race this past weekend, even this epic all-day-long coastline hike trail run thing just yesterday. So the first thing to know is there are now 3 sides of this watch. You've got the 42, the 47, and the 51mm. These are the exact same sizes of the Fenix 7 series, just carried over into the Epix series. Speaking of which, by the way, there's also the new Fenix 7 Pro series. I've got a separate video on that up in the corner there, but just in under like 30 seconds to explain the difference between the Epix and the Fenix 7, it's all really about the display. In the case of the Epix series, you have this AMOLED display. It's a lot more bright, more brilliant, versus in the Fenix 7 series, you have a MIP-based display. That tends to have longer battery life, though even that gets turned on its head a little bit here with the Epix Pro series. Now, I've got a separate video going into all the details of those, so definitely hit the subscribe button down the corner there, so when that drops in the next few days, you'll be right on top of things. Now, so you may be asking, what does this do to the price? Well, the simple answer is, it's the same. The Epix Pro series matches the same prices of the original Epix series, meaning that the base edition is $899 and the Sapphire edition is $999. The only differences between those 2 different levels is that the Sapphire edition has sapphire glass and the Sapphire edition also has preloaded maps on it. But maps are free to download on all the watches, and unlike in the past, all editions now are 32 gigs and all editions have multiband GPS, which I suppose it probably just ruined one of my things for just a second. Now, the biggest new hardware feature on the Epix series is likely the addition of the flashlight. We saw the flashlight being added on the Fenix 7X series as well as the Instinct 2X, and now it's finally here in Epix. You can see the LEDs of the flashlight right there on that upper edge, and I can double tap the button there to go ahead and turn it on, or I can go into the menu here and change the flashlight configuration. So right now it's at 2 of the 4 levels of white light, or I can go down into red light. Now the flashlight has a couple different purposes. One being the obvious, to be able to find something in your tent in the middle of the night or out in a pathway, whatever the case may be. But it also can go ahead and match your running cadence to basically make a strobe light while you're running along. That way other people or bikes or vehicles can go ahead and see you. From a brightness standpoint, it's pretty much on par with my iPhone flashlight. It's basically in the same realm, slightly different angles in terms of the light beam and whatnot, but it's basically all in the same camp there. I find it just super useful from a day-to-day standpoint. I've been traveling a ton the last month or so, and I've been in either 6 or 8 different hotels just in the last month alone. So navigating a dark hotel room in the middle of the night, it's just handy to have a flashlight, you double tap it, and boom, it's on. I mostly tend to use the red light mode because it's plenty bright in the middle of the night, but you do have the white mode if you want it. This is one of those things that sounds silly, but everyone who's used a flashlight on the Garmin devices over the last year and a half is best feature ever. The next new bit of hardware is a different type of light. So I'm going to turn these off real quick. There we go. And flip it over, and you see the new optical heart rate sensor, or the new Biosensor. This is Garmin's Elevate Gen 5 sensor. And in particular, it's gone ahead and spaced out the LEDs on the back there. Probably get them turned off, put my finger on for just a second here. There we go. You can see the green lights there turning on. There's also red light as well used for SpO2 sensing, or what Garmin calls pulse ox. Garmin says by spacing out the LEDs a little bit more, they get better accuracy on certain types of movements, in particular wrist-based movements. So things like if you're weightlifting or stuff like that, where you may be bending your wrist. If you're not familiar with optical heart rate sensors, outside light is generally considered the arch nemesis of optical heart rate sensors. So the goal being that when you might flex your wrist and get outside light into there, it'll handle that better. And not to spoil my accuracy section for later on in this review, which you still should definitely watch, but this is the best results I've seen in the Garmin watch to date from an optical heart rate sensor. Now you may be asking whether or not this new hardware also supports ECG, something that Garmin just rolled out on their Venue 2 Plus series a couple months ago. And the answer to that is a little bit circuitous. Now the reason for this, just to understand, is that Garmin legally, according to the FDA, cannot comment on devices that are not yet certified. However, there are some pretty obvious signs this will support ECG. The very first one is that you can clearly see the ECG isolation ring on the inside of the optical sensor. That allows you to do that ECG and keep it isolated from the rest of the metals in the back of the watch. That's something that Garmin only puts on their ECG-capable hardware. The second and most obvious thing, when I asked Garmin whether or not this is capable of ECG, they said it's not capable of ECG today, and that's as far as they would comment. When I've asked Garmin that question on all the other watches that were definitely not hardware capable, they were very, very clear in saying this does not have the ECG hardware inside. But for this one, they have to stay inside that little legal box. Now, if and or when ECD will release for this watch remains to be seen. That could be something that happens in a few weeks or a few months, or it could be never if they don't get the certification for this particular unit. Next up is the battery life. In particular here, we see a pretty big shift and increase in battery life on the larger edition, the 51mm edition. You can see the chart right here. In this case, the blue text is the always on display. By default, it's not always on, meaning that when you raise your wrist up, it will turn on the display, and you put it down, it will turn off the display. In my testing, I'm using the always on configuration all the time. It's always on, just because that's the way I like it. That means the display is always on in a dim state when you put your wrist down, but it goes to full brightness when you come back up again. And looking at this chart here, this is spot on with my testing. So in the case of the middle-sized unit right there, I'm seeing a very consistent 5 to 6 days of battery life with roughly 1 to 2 hours of GPS time per day. Some days it's 1 hour, some days it's 2, some days it's 3 or 4, but on average 1 to 2 hours of GPS usage per day. However, the real kicker is the bigger unit here. So the 51mm edition gets up to 11 days in always-on configuration. And that too was held true. When I charged it up, it showed 11 days, and then steadily each day I lost 1 day battery life. Now, the last couple of days I've been doing 6-hour GPS workouts per day, so that obviously dove that down a little bit there. But up until that point, it was exactly on track for about 11 days of battery life in always on display with actual real world GPS usage and navigation and all that kind of fun stuff. Those sort of battery life stats are mind-boggling for an AMOLED display, especially since they actually hold water. And what's really interesting about the Epix 51mm unit is that it actually has an Enduro 2 battery inside of it. That's notable because it's, well, one, a heck of a lot bigger battery, but the reason they could do that is because the AMOLED display technology is actually thinner than the MIP-based display technology on the Fenix series, meaning they've got more space inside, and they use up that space to just literally put a bigger battery in there. Next is a quickie, which is the addition of multiband or dual frequency GPS to all models, all editions of Epix. Versus the past, only the Sapphire edition. Multiband or dual frequency GPS is considered like the holy grail of GPS accuracy. It allows you to get crazy good GPS tracks even under this cliff overhang yesterday that I was in, where the track looks beautiful despite having half the sky or more than half the sky blocked by this ginormous cliff. The next new feature is called RedShift Mode, which is a software feature that allows to change the display to a red-only look. I can access that by going into the controls menu, just up the left-hand button for a second, and then go down to RedShift. So got to circle around here and find it. There we go. Now watch. It'll turn everything to red. So it's kind of like some of Garmin's tactical units, but not really designed for that, just designed to make it a little bit easier at night for you to see things. What's cool though is this overlays across everything in the watch, so you can just use it in this mode if you want to. I suspect this is one of those things you'll either love it or never use it whatsoever. I tend to fall into the never use it camp, but to each their own. Oh hey, just a quick note, if you're finding this video useful or interesting, now would be a great time to whack that like button at the bottom there. It really does help out this video and the channel quite a bit. Next up, we have a few new metrics. The first one is called endurance score. You can see the endurance score on the watch itself as well as Garmin Connect. I go down to the widgets and you see it right there. I can tap on that using either the touchscreen or the buttons to see how it's trended over the last 3 months or so. Now the goal with endurance score is to do a better job of endurance activities that aren't just running and cycling. Garmin said that part of the problem with some of the existing metrics is they didn't scale well to other sports. So for example, ice skating, like really long ice skating, like Finland going, forever ice skating. Probably no coincidence that the team behind this is based in Finland. Anyways, the whole point of this is to be able to go ahead and account for basically non-running and non-cycling things as well as running and cycling. You can see the sports that are my top contributors at the bottom there, swim, bike, and run, because that's what I do. But if I had other sports that were contributing to that, it would show up here. The endurance score itself is a blend of a few different things. It's looking at your VO2 max, it's looking at the intensity of that particular activity and the duration of that particular activity. In general, duration's more important here than just pure intensity. The idea being that unlike VO2 max, which you can't really compare super well between different people, is that endurance score you can kind of compare between different people. When I talked to the Finland team about this and what the numbers look like, they said that they probably see the very top end of the endurance score for a pro level Ironman athlete being probably in the 12,000-ish or just shy of the 12,000-ish range. I've been training for a half Iron recently. You can see I'm floating in the 81 to 8,200 range. My wife has been training as well for stuff and she's up in the 9,200 range. So it's just going to depend on what you're doing. Again, on the whole, the idea here is to be able to account for those longer endurance type efforts. And in general, it trends that way. Still, I've seen some weird quirks that I just can't account for. Scenarios where I've gone out for a couple-hour ride and it's incremented my value by one digit. And then I've gone for a 30-minute super easy chill swim, like basically should have been like floating with a cocktail or something in my hand, and it's incremented by like 50. And I'm like, what? So for me, the jury's still a little bit out on this. Which gets us to the next new feature, which is the hill score. So I go back here, go down, and you see hill score right there. I crack into this, and it's got basically a couple different metrics. In the middle of the screen, you see my current level at 77 out of 0 to 100 on the color coding there and showing us skilled. And you can see my current 4-week elevation gain at 16,114 feet. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of up lately. For someone that lives in the flattest place on earth, this has been a lot of going up hills for me lately. So if I go down though, there's basically two different categories here. Hill endurance and hill strength. There's also VO2 max on the bottom, which plays into this. But the idea here is that hill endurance is about your sustained efforts, whatever the intensity is, over long periods of time. So the idea of like literally my hike up a mountain or a volcano or whatever the heck it was, that goes into hill endurance. Hill strength is about how fast you go up that particular section of hill. So from there, you can basically see that someone may be very good at going up steep sections, but maybe not lasting as long, versus someone else, me, is really good at going up a long-ass, big old chunk of dirt, but maybe not as fast. Now, as cool as the concept is, in my mind, the jury's still a little bit out here as well. If we look at that number right there, that 16,000 feet, that was really like clumped into basically just 4 major runs. I had one run up an 8,000 foot mountain, one run over the course of a 5,000 or so foot thing. But as I said, I live in a pancake flat place. I am not a very good runner up hills or down hills. I do have a lot of like dedication to going up a big hill, but when I got my very first hill score after that 8,000 foot mountain, I had me almost in the elite category. You can see it right here. It's since gone down because I haven't run up another 8,000 foot mountain. And while I'd love to say I'm elite in something, it'd be pretty hard to say that I'm even anywhere near a pro level ultra marathoner or something like that can go up and down hills like it's nothing at all. So I don't really understand. And when I asked Garmin, it didn't seem like they had a great answer either for why my score was that high. And they kind of admitted it probably should have been that high, but I'm not looking like a gift horse in the mouth here, but I don't know what to say there. Anyways, it's important to note that hill score is only for running or trail or hiking type activities. It's not for cycle climbing. So if you're on a bike, this is not accounted for in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't do anything for you. You have to be on your feet going up a hill. In any case, the next new feature has nothing to do with scoring of any sort. Instead, it's looking at the weather. You can now see live weather radar maps on your watch within the weather widgets. This includes precipitation, temperature, wind, and clouds. And in theory, this would be cool, except it's only in the weather widget, meaning if I go back here to my main screen, go down, I find weather, there we go, weather right there, boom, all the way down the bottom again, and that is where it is, right there. It's not something displayed when you're like navigating or have a route or anything like that. That does not show weather there at all, which just seems like a massive miss to me, because that's honestly the only time I care about the weather like overlays. I mean, I appreciate some people probably care about this, but that's what my phone is for, versus when I'm hiking, that's when I actually want to see it on my wrist. Hopefully though, that's an easy thing for them to add in a firmware update down the road. I gotta imagine it'd be an easy thing to do, because it is kind of cool. And that segues right into the next new feature, which is also map-based, which is the addition of shaded relief maps. So now all maps have shaded relief on them, which basically is the shading that you see there. This gets downloaded into your maps automatically, so it's not something you have to do extra. It just comes there, it's on by default. Next is a pretty big shift in the way Garmin is doing activity profiles or sport profiles. With this, they're adding 30 new activity profiles to the Epix and Fenix 7 Pro series. You can see them all on the screen right there, but the key thing to understand is that up until now, Garmin has mostly only added sport profiles when they had data behind them. Meaning that if you went water skiing, you would see actual water skiing data, like the runs for your water ski and so on. All that stuff is figured out and calculated. Versus most other watch companies don't have unique custom sport data per sport. They just kind of say, this is a sport profile for categorization purposes. Both approaches have their pros and cons, but people, rightfully so, including myself, got more and more frustrated with the lack of sport profiles to do that categorization on the watch itself. So now that's largely solved. What Garmin's going to do from there, though, is they're going to look at actual usage of these added sport profiles and figure out which ones it makes sense to build out the data behind them. So thus moving them from the categorization realm to the fully data metric realm. Next up, we got a slate of quickies. The first one is a new data page that allows you to split the map page in half, basically showing data on one side and your map on the other. After that, there's a new perimeter data page. So you can have the map in the middle and you can have your data around the outside edge as the perimeter. That's kind of cool too. Then after that, there's a very slight UI change. You don't see it very often, but it's here and there. One area you do notice it, there's this long hole at the lower right hand button like this, and it brings up a recents menu. And you can see these are recent widgets being used. And you can access this from within a sport menu or anywhere on the watch you want to. But it's not though the nice new user interface found on the Garmin 400 965 165 or 265. Garmin says they wanted to maintain a more like pro look to it, and I kind of get that, but coming from the 965 to this feels dated. Like there's no two ways about it. And I get that not everyone likes the watch faces in the 965, but if you set aside the watch face and just look at all the stuff underneath the covers, this really does feel dated coming from the 965. And it's just, I don't understand why you have all these user interfaces. No one wants that. They just, what? I don't know. In any case, something more positive is, as I mentioned earlier, every single watch has 32 gigs of storage now. So just to be really clear on that, all of them have the same amount of storage space, which means you can download plenty of region maps on there. As a general rule of thumb, maps for like a given region in Europe or in the US are like 8 to 12 gigs a pop. And of course, you can download maps using either Wi-Fi directly to the watch itself, or you can use your computer, which is, by the way, way faster, to go ahead and download those maps using an app called Garmin Express. Now, next up is something I probably shouldn't have saved for the last because it's just so much better, which are the charging times. They've made them drastically faster. In the previous edition of both the Epix and the Fenix 7 series, you went from 0 to 90% in about an hour and 45 minutes, which just, it's a long ass time. Versus now, it's pretty much spot on an hour to 90%, and then trickle charges the last 10% over the course of roughly a half an hour. Particularly if you're really low on battery, you get 10% of battery life in just 5 minutes, which is more than enough for a couple-hour workout. Now, if you're an existing Fenix or Epix owner wondering whether or not these new features will come to those watches, the simple answer is yes, or mostly yes anyways. I'll put a list down the screen right now of all the features that are coming, but Garmin says those two units should basically remain more or less clumped together from a feature standpoint. Obviously, there's some hardware elements like the flashlight and stuff like that that will differentiate them, but from an overall feature standpoint, those should remain the same as long as the hardware permits it. Okay, so now before we jump in the accuracy section, just a quick note that I got a full user interface guide video on this watch up in the corner there. It's like 45 to 60 minutes long, and I walk through every feature step by step, more from a daily usage standpoint, all sorts of pro tips and stuff like that, so check that up in the corner. So with that, let's jump over the computer and talk about heart rate, GPS, elevation accuracy, as well as battery life during workouts. So starting off on a bit of an easier route here, the Epix and the Fenix Pro, both of them were great spot on. Note here, you can really see the difference between Garmin's multiband configuration and Coros's with the multiband there, where it's just going off all over the place. As far as the heart rate, these were both exactly the same compared to the chest strap, very, very good. Even if I look at some hard intervals, like this session right here, a little bit of latency on the first two intervals, but other than that, the final intervals were pretty good. If I look at that hike that I did up in the mountains, here you can see it's spot on the track back and forth, and this is some pretty complex terrain. Here's what that exact same spot looks like in the satellite view. And then here, by the way, is that overhang. The Garmin's were much better than the both Suunto and Vertex in terms of accuracy there, but all of them are very, very close. If I look at the elevation plot, again, spot on here, no real concerns. Now looking at the Ironman race, everything is pretty much exactly where I expected. In fact, actually outperforming the Edge 840 in one little section, but by and large, it's pretty much the same. If I look at the swim there, you can see it looks perfect. Like it's really, really crispy across the board. And the heart rate here from the bike, despite being on kind of bumpy roads with rain and descending and all that kind of stuff, isn't too bad. It's not great, but it's not too bad. Whereas if I look a little more traditional bike ride, this is the gravel bike ride I did the other day, you can see here the GPS tracks are really, really sharp. Even in the woods, no problems at all. They're pretty much right on, beating the Crew 2 bike GPS unit. And the heart rate is exceptionally good here across the board, only kind of varying in a couple minor scenarios where I was drifting or coasting downhill. Battery-wise, the Epix and the Fenix Pro were surprisingly similar. For example, that 6.5 hour hike, basically almost both of them are about 50 hours burn rate, meaning the last 50 hours. This is full navigation, all the things turned on. And then here on the Ironman race, both of these were trending towards about 45 hours for both units, again with all sensors connected. And the only case where I saw them slightly different was on this gravel bike ride here, where the Fenix about 56 hours and the Epix about 39 hours, likely because it was very sunny out and I had some solar gains on the Fenix 7 Pro Solar. Okay, so with that, where do we stand? Is this watch worth it? Well, it depends on where you're coming from. If you're coming from an existing Epix series watch, it's probably not worth the upgrade unless you really want that flashlight, or you want one of the alternate sizes. A lot of people really want an Epix watch, but just didn't want the middle size. Now you have both those sizes. From an accuracy standpoint, the GPS is on point, just like it was in the past. Continues to be industry leading across the board. There's really no company that has as accurate GPS in that multi-band configuration today. From a heart rate sensor standpoint, again, as you saw there, very, very solid. And then from a battery standpoint, I'm really happy with the battery here too. My only complaints here are really around some of the quirks with hill score and endurance score, and especially also the whole like not having your history pulled into that correctly sort of thing. But those are both features that a lot of people might not care about anyways, and probably over time those quirks will get ironed out. And then again, as far as Epix versus Fenix, I've got that separate video dropping in a few days here as well, where I'll dive into my thoughts on that, though it hasn't really changed a whole lot since last time. With that, thanks for watching. There is a ton more good stuff coming down the pipe here, so definitely hit the subscribe button down in the corner. Have a good one.